just to explain what's happening this evening. First of all, actually to welcome everybody to this joint meeting of Food Inequalities Rebellion and the Brent Right to Food campaign. The reason why we've organised this meeting is because a few months ago, as you're aware, there was a national food strategy. Right to food was omitted from that food strategy. And in a few months' time, there'll be a white paper. So what we're really about is trying to put pressure on the government in order to include the right to food in that white paper. But more than that, we need to be organised to make it real on the ground in our communities, in our boroughs in London, and to make London a right to food city. So that's what we're about tonight. It's not just about talking, it's about organising. Martin Caraher will be speaking first. After Martin, we'll have our local speakers, and then we'll have Ian. So Martin, for people who don't know Martin, then Martin is a what is now to be known as an Emeritus Professor at City University. But Martin's whole life has been spent organising around food poverty, food inequalities, doing huge amounts of research in those areas in order to try and change the food system, particularly for people living in poverty, to make the food system more equal for people. So Martin has a huge history in the food movement, and so I won't say any more than that, because I'll take up too much time, but I'll just pass over to Martin, who's going to open tonight, talking about giving a sort of the national perspective on a rights-based approach to food and the right to food. So I'll now mute and pass it over to Martin.
Hi, everybody. As Sharon said, I'm Martin Carragher. I'm Professor Emeritus, which means I'm retired and I can do what I want, as opposed to doing what the university wants me to do. I think the right to food is necessary. It's a part of a solution, but it's not on its own sufficient to address food poverty and insecurity. So we need to be clear about what we're calling for, and I'll talk about that as I go along. So what do we mean by the right to food? For London, it's not specified in the London Food Strategy. There's very little on food inequality or right to food in the London Food Strategy. So maybe we need to think about the London Food Strategy and indeed some of the public health strategies. I want to come back to that later because the mayor has power over public health strategies. The current agenda around the right to food is dominated by charity provision, and even the London Food Board reflects that concern, that a number of members of the London Food Board are very closely connected to the charity sector, i.e. food banks and charity provision. So the right to food is enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights 1948. So the problem with that is that it's Article 25. It's not legally binding. So governments don't have to meet the requirements of the UN Declaration from 1948. However, there are some further UN declarations. The 1966 International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights and the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child both explicitly name adequate food and housing as basic human rights. They put a duty on governments, and the UK government has signed up to this, but it's a negative obligation. Legally, what that means is government don't have to do anything. They must not do anything that would prevent citizens and residents from accessing food, but they don't have to make it easier to access food. So they can't put barriers in the way. However, the UN Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights sent a letter in 2012 identifying 4 requirements for the right to food. And they said that policies introduced in times of austerity must be a temporary measure. And the policy, if it's cutting back on issues, must be necessary and proportionate in the sense that it must address inequalities, and it mustn't be discriminatory. And the 4th thing, it must be identify minimum core content of rights. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty has come back and said the UK is in breach of this. So I think there's an issue here about how we use the right to food. In India and in Brazil, it's been used to take the government to court and get those rights enshrined, but also to get action on those rights. So it's not just about getting something written into a policy, it's about how we use that policy in the long term. So if it was written into the London food strategy or into a national food strategy, we could then hold the government to account on that. So, you know, you all know, since COVID, we've seen a 5-fold increase in food poverty across London. The numbers have massively increased. Sharon talked about the National Food Strategy, and Sharon brought to my attention the fact that Henry Dimbleby, who's the author, not the sole author, but he's in charge of the National Food Strategy, when questioned about the right to food at a parliamentary committee, said he had not included it because it became politically polarizing. So the government are actually really nervous about the issue of the right to food. I think even local government are. I think if you look at how few local authorities have taken up the Labour hunger campaign and signed up to its tenets, you'll see even people on the Labour side are very nervous about the right to food. Partially because there is the fear that it may impose more costs on local authorities. But the National Food Strategy, as Sharon says, there's a government white paper to be produced in 6 months' time. We need to lobby, but I really don't think that we're going to get a right to food built into that, because it's up to government. They will pick and choose what's in the plan that Henry Dimbleby has laid out. In many ways, the plan, there's some very radical things in the plan, including a sugar and salt tax, which will be used, a hypothecated tax, which will be used to fund health promoting type activities under the new health promotion agency. The problem is there's no governance behind it, and there's no right to food built in there. I'm not sure we should waste our time. I think we should lobby, but I think probably they're going to pick and choose from the plan what they're going to respond to. The day after the plan came out, the Prime Minister was heard to say publicly that he didn't believe in a tax and he didn't see it as proportionate. So, you know, one of the more radical parts of the plan was already kicked into touch. So I think the lessons from the European continent are that a number of countries have tried to introduce a right to food, and these are ones with written constitutions. One of the problems with the UK, it hasn't got a written constitution, so it's hard to tie it down and hold government to account. But for London, I think there are a number of things we could do. We could get it written into local authority, into all the various borough strategies. We could get it written in by the mayor. Now, the mayor has a policy function for public health, and it's one of the things that crosses London. One of my concerns about food poverty more generally is that the link between hunger and obesity is great. So the same groups that are hunger are largely the same groups that are overweight and obese. I mean, of course, the whole population is gaining weight, but it's more likely, if you're on low income, you're more likely to be hungry and obese. Now, if we think about that, the root causes are pretty much the same. And if you think about what Michael Marmot has said, this is about inequity. It's about inequality, essentially. So we've got to tackle the issue of inequality. Not just food inequality, but income inequality and social inequality. And we've seen, you know, I mean, over the period of the pandemic, but even leading up to the pandemic, inequalities were rising, and now life expectancy gaps are increasing again. This is practically unheard of in Western countries. The pandemic has something to do with that. But my point here is that we could link the powers of the mayor with public health, which cross the whole of London, to link it to food poverty and obesity and in food insecurity. I think that's a potential. I think The mayor hasn't done a lot during the pandemic. He could have done a lot more around food insecurity. He could have coordinated a response across the boroughs. I think that one of the things that's very disturbing is the level of food insecurity among young children. I've got a report which came from, ironically, a right-of-centre think tank called the Social Market Foundation, and it's showing that the number of children with very low food security, in Redbridge it's running at 17,000 children, in Tower Hamlets 15,000, in Newham 18,000, in Harrow 12,000, in Brent 16,000, in Hackney 12,000, Wandsworth 12,000, Lewisham 12,000. These are big numbers. In Ealing, the borough I live in, it's running at 15,000. When I showed this to local authority members, they were astounded. And this comes from, as I said, these data come from a right-of-centre think tank called the Social Market Foundation. And hopefully we can make these slides available to you afterwards, and you can link on to the links. The right to food. I mean, I've just seen a report from the Bakers Union. I think it's called the Bakers Union, and they're worried. I mean, one of the groups, they're saying 1 in 5 of their workers are suffering from food insecurity. And these are people in contact with food. So a number of the unions are now calling for a right to food legislation. So there's more, there are more alliances to be made there. Okay, I think one of the areas to learn from is Scotland. Scotland produced a dignity report. And of course, the pandemic to some extent has interfered with what's happened. It's put things on a slightly different timescale. But the dignity report it set up targets so that there should be no new growth in food banks, and people should not be relying on food banks for access to healthy and affordable food. But everybody should have an adequate income. So the dignity report from Scotland, this is going to be written into Scottish law, is a way forward. And their argument is that charity does not deal with the roots of food poverty. I mean, it's necessary for people in order not to go hungry, but it doesn't get to the roots. So the Scottish government are doing some very interesting things. The Northern Ireland government have currently a strategy out for consultation, and the right to food is in there. They're looking for responses to that strategy, and they're talking about tackling it more from an inequalities perspective. Okay, so I'm going to finish just with a couple of questions. I mean, this is for the whole group and for maybe also all to think about. I don't have the answers. I mean, if I had the answers, I'd be selling them and retiring in luxury, but you know, there are no easy answers. So where should the right to food be enshrined for Londoners? I mean, we'll hear from some of the local projects later on in the local areas and what's happening. The danger is that the right to food can be defined within consumer models of low price. The Labour government in 2008, when it produced its food strategy, talked about low prices in supermarkets, and this was good for consumers. There is a danger that the government will interpret access to food within a consumer model of low price, but also low wages. Should the mayor declare a public health emergency for London related to both obesity and food poverty and the right to food? And how would we use the right to food? I mean, we know from the environment sector, people have taken governments to court. I think we have to be very bold about this and think about holding people to account. Maybe not taking them to court, but certainly monitoring them and evaluating them. And I think, how do we link to existing campaigns? I mean, there is a lot going on in this area. So how do we link to those campaigns? The Labour Hunger campaign, the work that the Trussell Trust is doing. To what extent do we get into bed with charity sector? I mean, there are tensions here. We need to have a think about that.
That's brilliant, Martin. Thank you. And I think some of those questions we'll raise with Ian as well when he comes, particularly questions about, you know, whether Labour's a bit nervous about taking on the right to food. and the whole question of finance. I think it's a big question for Labour at the moment, for Labour councils. The issue of, you know, financing this is quite a big one. So the next person who's going to speak is Kemi Akinole, who's a councillor in Wandsworth. She's a Labour councillor in Wandsworth. She's deputy leader of the Labour group in Wandsworth. But she's also famed in London for a project called Be Enriched, and for the Brixton People's Kitchen, Brixton People's Kitchen. So and she has a big history in organising as against food poverty in London and feeding people in London, people in need in London. So and she does that on the ground and does that politically as well. So I won't say any more, but I'll just pass over to Kemi.
Hi, yes, I'm Kemi, Councillor Kemi Akinole, Deputy Leader in Wandsworth Council, which is majority Conservative, and I am not. I want to be Enriched, which is a community, a charity I set up in 2013, was initially for young people, and then we did a community meal because I realized that young offenders were spending most of their time digging up like gardens and repainting walls and not really gaining any practical skills. So we brought them to the kitchen for 2 months to see if we could teach them how to cook, and they really loved it. But most important, not just love, actually they cried. A lot of them cried, but most importantly, the people that came were really hungry. So after 2 months, we couldn't just pull that rug from underneath their feet. So we had this one community meal, and then we had 3 community meals, and then we had teaching people how to cook in the community. And then we recently bought a bus. I think there's a slide to show somewhere, and it's actually something that I think could be one of the solutions around rights to food. Because if the issue is access, and I know Sharon's just said it's not about low costing food. It isn't about low costing food, but it is about affordable food, and it is about bringing food to people who may be geographically disadvantaged. My comms person said I should have to say you're all welcome to come volunteer, and we're always looking for volunteers. So that's fine. So that's my background. Brixton People's Kitchen is amazing as well. But my background politically is a little bit different. I don't know if all of you actually understand the powers that local authorities have, or what we actually do there, because it can be a bit misleading. You probably think a lot of the councillors don't do anything. It does come across that way. Some of them don't. I work all the time. But the things that we actually have control of are statutory services like adult care in terms of health, children's services, including some schools. Most of the secondary schools are academies, which means we have no control over them. Some of the primary schools are academies. Some of them aren't. I mean, that's London-wide. And then schools for special educational needs, PRUs, so on and so forth. We also kind of run waste and recycling services. Some councils do it a bit better than others, but we make sure that your rubbish gets picked up, or if it doesn't get picked up, when you complain, someone will eventually respond and pick up your rubbish. And housing, of course, which is, I think, very much linked to this whole rights-based approach to supporting people, because I think it's fair to say housing is a big issue. You have some housing, you don't have housing, it's inappropriate housing, it's too small, it's temporary. That's a massive issue in London. And also the cost of it, which is absolutely outrageous in my humble, but it's not really humble, in my opinion, in everyone's opinion. And you're absolutely right, Sharon, that when I broached to my Labour group about the right to food, immediately everybody assumed that that means we have to feed people 3 meals 3 times a day. And we, the council, are responsible for making sure this plate of hot food arrives at everybody's house 3 times a day, which would be very expensive, as would buying shopping for everybody. It would be very expensive. But I think one thing that the COVID has shown is that when you've got the money from government, anything is possible. So I really think that we need to be lobbying national government for changes in law I don't think that the Mayor of London is the right person to go to, because as we've discovered over the years that draft London food plan, he can only make the suggestions to local authorities. He can't compel them to actually follow through with it. I don't know if the national food strategy is enforceable, but I do think that it does mean, we do need a change in law. So what kind of things can we do without money? We can, as a local authority, as yourself, you can lobby your councillors, your MPs, the people in power, businesses, for this particular idea, for businesses and charities and anyone that employs anyone, you can urge them to pay the London living wage. More money in pockets means more money that people can spend. I think that's a very simple, easy thing to do. I think local authorities can provide services that reduce other outgoings such as bills. One of the community, what's it called? Crew community, something. It's a cooperative energy organization, and they actually have a phone line that people can call. I guess it's not much good right now with all of our bills rising, but normally you can call it and then they can help you get it's like you switch on the phone for people that can't do it on the internet. Maybe they don't have the internet because they can't afford it. Local authorities can improve welfare advice services, such as I know you're saying that they can fund citizens' advice better, because that is like the go-to signposting organisation for other things. Again, that would mean more money in people's pockets to spend on food. And they can ensure that children in need, which are that's a very complicated one, children in need, because a child or a family would have to go to the council and say, my child needs food. And if you think about how psychologically that is for a parent to say, I'm unable to actually support and look after my own child, and I need someone else to come in just to provide food. A lot of families won't do that. And up until just before COVID, when the government changed the law, that's why a lot of families with no recourse to public funds weren't getting the help that they were entitled to, because they would have to declare their child as a child in need. I think also other fun things. I mean, the council can support voluntary groups with money to deliver things, actually to contract the charity sector, instead of just making us apply for grants. Making us apply for grants to deliver things. If you want someone to deliver a service, then you pay them properly. I doubt most people in the charity sector are being paid even living wage, probably not even minimum wage, to be honest. So I think that's really important. Increase the amount of community gardens and allotments, although that won't make like an immediate difference, but engaging people in food, letting them understand where food comes from, grow their own food, enjoy like good tasting food. I don't know if any of you have been to Booker's, but peppers and the food, it's disgusting. If they're watching, thanks for your donation. I think most importantly, the local authorities have to work in collaboration with all of the stakeholders and all of the departments. It has to be a joined up approach. And I think the biggest thing, the main thing, the one thing that I keep asking Wandsworth Council to do is to write a borough-wide food plan. Because once they have a food plan with measurements and a timetable, that's how we hold them to account. But they have to meet those. They have to meet those milestones, and then things actually get done. And if you can convince your local council to have one or do it, not a draft one, a proper one, I think that's the best way to compel local government to actually deliver access to food that everyone deserves.
We've got two more local speakers, which is a speaker from Brent and then Barry Duckett. So Alex is he's a university teacher. He writes. He's an academic, but he's also an activist like myself. And so I won't say any more now. So Alex can just fill you in on what's been happening over in Brent.
Thanks a lot, Sharon. As Sharon was saying, I am an activist in Brent. I have been for pretty much all my political life, but the food the right to food has really focused mine and other people's minds because of three reasons. I mean, Sharon asked me initially to talk why Brent, and in many respects, this is commonplace. One is that Brent has one of the highest incidences of diabetes type 2 in the country, second in London. Secondly, because we have one of the highest measures of child poverty. Around 20% of children in Brent are in poor households, however you want to consider that measurement. And thirdly, and I think equally importantly, because like other parts of the UK, metropolitan UK, in fact, even some semi-urban areas, we've got a very big food producing part of our borough in Park Royal. There's about around 2,000 workers who every day produce about 80% of the hummus or other kinds of dips that I don't know where to look now. Completely disoriented. I've only got two eyes. Okay, well, I'll look that way. It's not my best bit, but anyhow. So Backabor in Park Royal employs about 2,000 workers who are exactly the kinds of people, as a result of low pay, as a result of changing shifts, odd shifts, night shifts, odd working patterns, very intensive labor within their own workplace, are going to be the same people who might be represented in the poor households and will be represented in those hospitals or in those places of care where diabetes type 2 is taken care of. So I'd say the first thing about the right to food for me is about joining up the dots. And as Kemi was saying, is thinking through the food chain and getting into our heads, and especially amongst the wider public, that the way we consume food is conditioned by the way we produce it. To think across the food chain from shop floor, if you like, in that Backabor factory, right through to those that deliver the food, those that package it, that produce it, those that then hand it out in schools or in hospitals or care homes, wherever it may be, and those who put them on the shelves. That for me is political, because it is about thinking about power relations. It's saying this is not simply about ethical choices, about individual decisions that we're making as consumers, which we may or may not want to do, but it is also about acting as political agents collectively and thinking about how the connections between the poverty in the household, the high incidence of diabetes, are linked very much to how that hummus is produced in Backabor. So that's the first thing that I think is really important for me in terms of the right to food. The second thing is that, like Kemi, I think that it's very important to engage institutions. Our Brent Right to Food campaign is seeking, like Kemi was saying, for a Brent food justice strategy. But I think that there's two issues here. One is that we're a Labour council. We're a one-party state. She's in opposition in Wandsworth, but Brent is a Labour council, and there's a great deal of resistance to a substantive right to food strategy. There's no problem, or I don't see a major problem in the council writing a letter to Dimbleby or to the Secretary of State or to the government, a Tory government, saying, you know, the right to food should be enshrined in UK Parliament. And I think that would be a welcome contribution. But it's much harder to get Brent Council, the local authority, to produce a substantive food strategy, joining up the dots, as Kemi was saying, thinking about the right to food, not just about something dealing with poverty or inequality or insecurity, but also to link it up with health, to the workplace, to access to public spaces, to transport, etc. I think that there are real political issues about where the money comes from, but I think there's also a lack of political will. And I'm not saying that these strategies should be run on a shoestring from my perspective as an activist. I mean, I'll defer to people like Kemi and others, and certainly in Byrne or any others on this call who know about the detail of this. But I think there are creative ways in which even cash-strapped councils like Brent can facilitate the kinds of community-led food inequality, food insecurity initiatives by, for instance, providing, I think the high street is a very important place, especially under the current post-austerity, post-pandemic situation. Local councils can provide seed can lower the cost of accessing empty spaces in the high street, for instance, for community kitchens to be set up. I think they can map the empty spaces where land might be cultivated in a borough. And I think this is the second thing. If the first one is going through the institutions, the second thing is to involve the vast amount of initiatives that are already going on. And here I'm slightly embarrassed that I've got Dee Woods in front of me, who's hopefully joining us from the floor in her contributions, because Dee, as many of you will know, has been doing exactly this together with other institutions, SUFRA, North West London, for instance, another one that comes to mind, that for decades has been doing grassroots food strategies. They don't call it that. I don't know if you want to call it that, but they certainly have been doing food politics. And I think one of the attractions of the right to food is that it allows people like myself who have been coming at it from an institutional perspective, from the Labour Party, as a grassroots activist, to try and connect the institutions that have authority, that have some degree of power, to the grassroots mobilizations and activities that are political. The very final thing I'll say, because I think I've gone well over my 5 minutes, is the idea of the right to food highlights that there's a false economy in cheap food. So like Martin was saying, the cheap food line, and I suspect in this context it'll be uncontroversial, is a false economy. For all the reasons I've been saying, and forgive me if I'm mansplaining or preaching to the converted here, but I think the right to food has the possibility of saying, this is not about cost, it's about investing in society and investing in our communities, and it's a long-term investment in terms of our health, in terms of our education, the welfare of future generations. And I think that's a very powerful message to send through, because it's a radical one, but it's one that not many people can disagree with. And that is important, that we have to bring in Brent. We're starting very slowly. We're trying to mobilize the existing forces that are from the grassroots, but we're also trying to bring people with us that may not initially think they're political. Thanks very much.
So Barry is a tenants organiser in SE16 in Rotherhithe. He's an ex-rigger, which meant he worked on the River Thames for decades, or in the trade unions there as well. He was incredibly active, feeding people during COVID.
Right from the beginning of the pandemic, we could see the failings that were actually happening, especially with the local charities and with Southwark Council, because to receive any food off of anyone, you had to be nominated to the charities, or you had to be on Southwark Council's vulnerable list. And a lot of people, especially the elderly people, were not there. So what we actually did was we went around our own estates and we got a list together of people that were actually in need. In fact, our eldest one was 93 years of age. And we found that there was a lot of people who basically had nothing, people waiting for the universal credit to come through, who were on zero contracts. But the most annoying thing to me is that we never see anybody from the council come around to visit us. Our local MP never came around, any of our local councillors. But people were basically being cherry-picked, and that's what annoyed us more than anything, because at one time we were delivering 220 dinners a week, which went to show that there was a need for food, and there still is a big need for food now. But some of the charities, as I said, they were basically delivering 2 or 3 boxes on a big estate like I live on, and that's what made us go around and find these people. Now there is a right. There should be a right to food. I've actually asked Evelyn Akoto, who she's a cabinet member for Southwark Council. She's actually the member for health and well-being. If she would put it to cabinet to get Southwark to become a right to food borough. But there again, it seems that they don't want to be involved at the moment, because I think, number one, I suppose they think, where's the money going to come from? But we do have money. We're a very rich borough. And the problem is, if people like myself can go out and find these people that have been let down and are missing, and what also annoyed us more than anything was that food parcels that were coming from Southwark Council, if you're an 82-year-old man in a wheelchair and you get a parcel and it contains a couple of potatoes, it contains leeks, cabbages, a couple of apples, an orange and a piece of butter and some milk, 6 eggs and lentils, what could you do? You know, that wasn't sufficient enough to feed anybody. So we had to subsidise people as well by going round, which we're still doing now. So what I actually thought was I contacted a couple of other tenants associations, TRAs, and we created a food alliance where if I had more than I needed, I would share it with other people. But surely the right to food is part of life, isn't it? But some of these people, the elderly people, they wouldn't ask for help because they were too proud to ask for help. And a lot of them, not only food poverty, because they were locked down, it was also fuel poverty. So we had the 2 cases of poverty coming to us. But all I can say is people like Sharon and people like, other people I've worked with, like-minded people have realised. But when I realised that these charities, and of course, if you wanted to get something from the food bank, you had to be nominated by a local councillor, or you had to see the local MP to get nominated. Now, surely there must be another way around it, because if you're hungry and you don't know where to go, or or you're old and you can't get on a computer, where do you go? And this is why people on the ground like ourselves, who know exactly what's going on, we should be the ones that are advising Southwark on how they should go forward. And this government should listen to people like ourselves. And the mayor, I mean, what part did he play in it? What part did local organisations actually play during the pandemic? In my opinion, not very much.
Thanks, Barry.
But 2 people have said that, the mayor didn't do anything during the pandemic, but he organised the London Food Alliance, and that to send food out across the whole of London to every local authority. So yeah. I mean, he did.
How effective was it?
Because I'm actually on the subgroup that organised stuff, and we coordinated all the local authorities. They were feeding in data. We had data coming in from organisations on the ground. There was a constant communication with sort of food aid providers. They coordinated funding, and the original round wasn't open to many. It was people like myself advocating on behalf of others. That meant it opened up to a lot of people who weren't, charities or whatever else. So, the GLA did so much work to ensure that people got food. They took homeless people off the street and put them into hotels and hostels and made sure they got food.
Under what we're calling under the radar, there was another world existing, which is the world of Kelly, the world of Barry, where there was this food being organised on the ground that wasn't coming through the official channels. And so there was a lot of food going out, a lot of food was going out, but beneath that, and there was a lot of photographs going out of councillors giving out food, but beneath that, there was loads of people on council estates, particularly in tenants organisations, who are queuing at Tesco's to get, to go and feed people. I'm not going to say any more now, because this is about London, and that is about the London boroughs and the postcode lottery around the London boroughs around the right to food. And that's something that from tonight we'll keep meeting and discussing and ironing out. But in order to really get us going on this, we've got, the Ian Byrne, founder of Right to Food campaign, fan supporting food banks, that is really doing brilliantly around the country, and is really building a lot of pressure on the government through building in the grassroots to try and get the right to food put into law. So I'll just pass over to Ian. Yeah.
Right, thanks, Sharon. Look, apologies for being late. We had extra votes in Parliament, which I wasn't expecting when we arranged this, and hopefully you won't need subtitles because of the accents. I'm sure there's anyone from Liverpool here. Massive thanks to Food Inequalities, Brent Right to Food, and basically everybody who's always shown me so much solidarity in London. And when we went up and met Kelly and the team around South London about 8 weeks ago now, wasn't it? We took the mobile food pantry up, and it was a wonderful weekend of activism, people coming together and just showing solidarity from what we do in Liverpool. And I'll just run through that to give you a bit of background about why we got to where we are now with the right to food. So in 2015, when I was a trade union activist, and I was happy, I wasn't a politician, we went to a community centre. I'm from Anfield, I live a couple of minutes away from the ground. We went to a community centre and there's a queue of people outside. So myself and Dave Kelly, who's the Evertonian half of fan support and food banks, before the inception of it, we sat at this centre and we seen a queue of people, much like you were talking about before, you know, the underbelly. And it was a queue of people from my community, and I knew a couple of them who were queuing up, and I mistakenly said to the community activist organiser who's running the centre, bingo's busy today. And she turned around and said, Ian, it's not the bingo, it's the food bank. And took us in the back room, and it was run, like Kelly was saying, on donations from the community. And Anfield is one of the poorest wards in the country, if not Europe. So what I was actually seeing was a bag of pasta getting split up into little sweet bags, people who remember sweet bags, and it broke my heart, to be honest. I went home that night and couldn't sleep, just thinking like what was happening to our class, that they had to queue up and get given such paltry sums of food. So the idea then sprung from Support and Food Banks. Me and Dave have been involved with Liverpool and Everton, fighting for cheaper season ticket, cheaper ticket prices. And we thought, but tell you what, if everybody in Anfield, 60-odd thousand people, everybody in Goodison, 45,000 people, they're the two football stadiums, there's about a quarter of a mile between them. Every week, donated a tin of food, we could fill the food bank shelves. Food bank shelves, food banks should not exist. We know that, but that was what we seen as an immediate emergency. That was 2015. The next week we started, much like Kelly does at Millwall, with collection bins outside the ground. We got more chip wrappers than we got tins, but we got some tins, and we thought, you know what, there's something here. From that, fast forward to 2020, 35% of all food coming into Liverpool food banks was coming from football supporters. So, I mean, unbelievable show of solidarity from the city. But meanwhile, while we were doing that, we were building a network throughout the country. So from Newcastle to Southampton, fans were coming together, replicating that idea and building within their communities. And it's become such a fantastic conduit for bringing people together, pulling working class solidarity into like one hub, but also breaking down perceptions of football supporters, where they were seen as the bane in the community. Now they're seen as people that actually go out and aid the community. If we go to Newcastle supporters food bank, we take donations from Liverpool to Newcastle, again emphasising working class solidarity. Building this network, just remember that all the time. You're building a network, you're educating, you're breaking down barriers, you're making people realise who the real enemy is. The real enemy is the people that are forcing people into food banks and making society where we've got 15 million people who struggle to put a meal on the table, 4.5 million children in poverty. That's your enemy, not somebody who speaks in a Cockney accent, a Salford accent, a Geordie accent, wears a different colour football kit. Know who your real enemy is, and they're the enemies who we want people to focus on. So we built that. In 2019, well, I was asked to stand for Parliament. I did. It then be seen as an opportunity to take this activism into Parliament. Now, the manifesto what Corbyn put forward in 2019 was a thing of absolute beauty. It had the eradication of food banks. It was going to fight to end food poverty. The first foremost task, what we thought, was then to go into Parliament and keep that within the Labour Party manifesto. But once you get into Parliament, you realise that you get more opportunities to meet people like yourselves, utilise the MP's role, pull people together, and really, really focus it on the right to food. So we just carried on building the fan support and food banks, building the network, but looking at it politically. The right to food come about because in 2020, I sat on an EFRA committee, which was a Environment and Rural Affairs Committee. A chap called Henry Dimbleby, a few years now in this room, was tasked with implementing the first national food strategy since 1945 by the Conservative government. I seen that as a real opportunity to get the right to food without an election. You know, the Labour Party may not win the next election. We can't wait. We've got that many people, as we all know, in our communities who are struggling, and the only way to get around that was systemic change. So we seen that as a real opportunity. So what we did really quickly was formulated a pack, which was a model motion, which would go to councils, so they could declare themselves right to food areas, all the time putting it into people's heads. What is a right to food? We should be demanding a right to food. We should not be accepting what's happening in our communities. Proud to say, and you won't be surprised, the first city that declared itself a right to food city was Liverpool, and that was in December 2020. What we also did, we constructed a model motion which went to the council. We created a letter, so people were signing up to it, so activists within the community were signing. We had faith leaders, we had Kenny Dalglish, everybody's old enough to remember Kenny Dalglish, one of the great legends of Liverpool Football Club. So we had a huge array of people from across the community in Liverpool sign up to it, as well as the political elements to it. And again, it's everything we've ever done is building solidarity, is building collective strength, because that's where change comes from. So 2020 December, Liverpool declares itself right to food. What does that do then? Well, what we then did was set off an explosion which went across the country, and I always forget, so I'll get shouted at by me office manager if I don't read it out. Make sure that we give everybody who's actually taking part in this. So we had Liverpool, Manchester, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Liverpool City Region, Rotherham, Brighton and Hove, Harringay, St Helens, Preston, Lancaster, Durham, Newcastle, Portsmouth, Coventry, Sheffield, Birmingham and Lancaster all signed up with the sole aim of forcing Henry Dimbleby with the motion to put the right to food into the National Food Strategy. So we're building up pressure, working with the trade union movements, working with activists like yourselves, working with my great friends here over there. We were just building this collective of people coming together. Because when you're a parliamentarian for the Labour Party and you've got a 83-seat majority Conservative government, you don't win by me shouting as a left-wing gobby socialist from Liverpool, Boris, I want a right to food, which I have done, but it didn't work. You build collective power. You build collective power and you make people in Conservative constituencies wake up what's happening in their constituencies and build the pressure. In March this year, working with Shami Chakrabarti, working with physicians from Liverpool who were on the front line, fighting poverty, fighting the effects of poverty, we come up with a submission. Now, I won't bore the arses off you with going right through the whole submission, but what I'll give you is a couple of the top lines. There was 5 elements to it. If you want to know what the submission was, and I hate saying this because it feels like I'm selling myself, but it's on my website, www.ianburn.org. 2 of the key ones I want to focus on. Universal free school meals and breakfast for every single child in this country. If you look across, to Portugal, every child sits down. Universal free school meals, 3-course meals. Imagine what that does for community cohesion. Imagine what that does for educational attainment. Imagine what that does for society. That's where we should be looking at as a country. That's the type of vision that I'd like to have for our children. During COVID, we've done Zooms right across the country, so many different areas, and the overwhelming thing that people were saying was struggling to get the kids fed for school. Right on the breadline, universal credit, everything was against many of the people of our class, and that was one of the main concerns. So the universal free school meals, I feel the Labour Party and anybody in a decent society should be back into the hills, because that is transformational. If you want to look at it from an economic perspective, imagine what that could do for procurement, for local authorities to go out, procure food, work with local farming communities, food providers. It's an absolute game changer for society, and I feel so passionate about it. Another element of the submission that we put in to Henry Dimbleby was reasonable portions in benefits and wages, meaning the national living wage. We wanted the government of the day, regardless of what it was, Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, Green, didn't matter. They had to come to Parliament moving forward when the right to food goes into legislation. And they've got to tell people within a benefit what proportion of that benefit will actually mean that the person who's receiving the benefit can have a healthy, nutritious diet to survive and thrive on. We haven't got that at the moment, as we all know. So that was another key component of the submission that went in. Henry reported back in July, wasn't it? July, and he took elements of it from... He went on a journey with us over that 12 months. He poo-pooed the idea when we first raised it. He come on the journey with us, and he, to a degree, he took elements of it and answered them to a degree, but it was disappointing. He didn't go anywhere near far enough to see what we've seen doing in our communities. I understand the political constraints slightly, but I would have liked them to be far more ambitious and really tackle what we were seeing in our communities. But that gave us a great opportunity, and this is where we are now. The government have got 8 months to respond to the National Food Strategy in a white paper. We've now got 8 months to really come together as a class, right across the country, as a community, build collective strength, and push the government into really looking at the right to food in the next 8 months, because they've got to reply. They've got to put it within that white, they've got to reply in the white paper. So I feel as though this was a huge opportunity. And what happened over the last 4 weeks has given us real hope. No one's saying this was going to be easy. It's going to be bleeding hard to push a Conservative government that has just cut universal credit by £20, one of the most pernicious cuts ever, into a position where they've got to accept the right to food. 4 weeks ago, the trade union congress, every single trade union in this country signed up to the right to food motion that went through by the Bakers Union. 2 weeks ago in Brighton, Labour Party conference, unanimously, I've never seen it, every wing of the party sealed the deal for the right to food within the Labour Party conference adopted it that day. It now gives me an opportunity as a Labour Party MP to argue for the right to food within the Labour Party policy. These type of things, these sorts of movements have just come over the last 12 months by building this collective strength. We've got an almighty movement. We've had Acorn recently sign up, say we've got archbishops, faith leaders, building and building and building. You keep hearing me say that, that's all you'll ever hear me say, because that's what you've got to do. You've got to build a collective. For me, the right to food is probably the most important advancements I feel we can make politically at the moment. It will address what we're seeing, or help to address what we're seeing in our communities, systemic change, and it's the only way forward. I could probably stand here all day, speak to you what's happening in London, but if I tell you what's happening in Liverpool, fans supporting food banks, well, I explained before, run mobile pantries, so that's what we took to London. Tries to destigmatise food banks where you go in and get a choice. We're feeding 1,000 people a day throughout Liverpool. Now, that's a stick and plaster, and we've always said that. Everything we do, mutual aid, everything Kelly does, is all do in our community to keep people afloat, is a stick and plaster. We need systemic change. We need to eradicate food poverty. We need to end food banks. We need to give dignity back to our class, and we need to come together collectively to do that. You've got to put all differences aside, because for me, this is one of the most important battles we'll ever fight, because an army can't march on an empty stomach, and they know that, and we know that. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I think we have a conflation of several issues. Reason why most people cannot eat and eat well is because of austerity legislation, because they can't access enough money, right? Be it through work, be it through welfare, to be able to afford to buy food, right? Brexit thing is another issue in terms of our country not being food resilient. All right, we do not produce enough food here to support our country. And part of what should have been, you know, in that wonderful food strategy was us increasing our food production here, right? We need to localize our food production, right? What, almost half of our food comes from elsewhere. 98% of our fruits come from Europe, right? And a lot of those things, if you really follow the supply chain, they're coming from Asia, they're coming from Africa. So we need to build our local food system here, right? But we don't have farmers, we don't have people with skills to pick food or know how to plant food, right? There's no support whatsoever coming down from government in terms of training next generation of farmers, right? There's an issue with access to land as well, all right? So right now those problems around Brexit, right, could have been dealt with years ago because they knew this was coming, right? They knew we would have issues, right? And we could have avoided some of these things. Some of us were speaking to government departments in terms of supporting people in household food insecurity. And we were laughed at, or correction, I was laughed at when I said, well, okay, we need to be farming, we need to be opening up land, right? Even right now in London, right? The London Food Board is working with other charities and organizations trying to open up land so we could be farming, so that we could be training people, not just in hospitality, but in food skills, driver skills, all those things. We are working hard to try and make that happen.
I don't know. I think we're not being radical enough. I mean, I think when Dee's right, you know, these are not new issues. Think back to 2000 and the fuel blockade, and the supermarkets were 2 days away of running out of food. We knew then the food system was not fit for purpose. The Labour Party, when in government, produced a 2008 Food Matters report, a 2030 report. There was a strategy. I mean, it was a good strategy. Labour were then kicked out of government, but it was a reasonable strategy. The National Food Strategy does address these issues in its defence. I mean, I'm interviewing Henry Dimbleby at the weekend at the Dartmouth Food Festival. I'm going to ask him some of these questions, but it's not dealing with food poverty. He's on record as saying it's too politicised. If he's saying that, and he does say in the beginning of the report, he was told not to cover these issues. I mean, I don't hold out much hope that government will, in the white paper, will address this. I've been working on this since 1986, and I hear the same issues again and again and again. I think what we learn from the right to food from other countries, it's where groups, usually NGOs, have been very radical and taken government to account, usually through the courts. The case of India, the case of Belgium, the case of Brazil. If we get it written in some way, we can hold them to account. But and we need resources to follow that. It's not going to happen without resources. I mean, you know, the universal credit £20 reduction is an absolute crime that government should be taken to court for.
2015, we started with wheelie bins. Last night in Colombia, we initiated a project. Now that's just come from an absolute insistence that we're not going to accept it. And that, Martin, is what we're trying to build here. A collective, through people, through communities coming together. That's where your resource is. Your resource is people. Your resource is what we've actually got. Now, you can supply all the academic stuff. What we try to do is create a grassroots, people-powered campaign to change the opinions of Johnson and other people. And I'm quite happy to really to go hell for leather on this, because we will do. And as I said, the example what we did in Colombia yesterday, now I couldn't be prouder. 6 years ago, we started with 2 wheelie bins outside Goodison. Last night, we were having a civic reception in a town in northern Colombia because we were donating, because it was the initiative by what we pulled together, pulling groups together to hopefully keep dengue at bay in that community which has suffered terribly from COVID. That's working class solidarity. That's what we feel as though we can supply here and build. And for me, that's what it's all about. So I've got to have hope that we cannot carry on like this. And I know I couldn't agree more with what you said about the universal credit cut. You know, they admitted today, or they admitted yesterday, that they've done no modelling on the outcomes of what it's going to do to our communities. We know what it's going to do to our communities. That's why we're here talking about this tonight. But for me, I've got to have optimism. I've got to wake up in the morning and feel as though I'm building something. We're building something as fans supporting food banks. We're all building something in this room that can affect change. Because if we don't, how can we accept what's happening in our communities? It's unacceptable. And I think that was a really good point what you made about I've got an 80-odd seat majority, but change happens from the grassroots. Change has always happened from the grassroots. Change goes from flows up. So for me, that's what we're trying to do. So I'm going to stay optimistic that if we build the movement, we can affect the change.
I feel like there's not much more I can tell anybody about feeding children, and I'm just wondering if what you think is the next most important campaign that can be run that will also encourage that, you know, move towards the right to food, the right place approach.
Do we separate the submission of the and concentrate on elements of it, or?
Well, I was just wondering if there's anything other than children's food that we could talk about that you think could be like pushed forward.
Well, I think what we've started to do within the right to food submission, Dee's spot on. It's poverty, isn't it? You know, it's income. You know, basically people haven't got the ability to go into a shop and buy their own food. That's why we're in this sort of predicament. What we've started to do with the Right to Food campaign is focus people's minds on the food elements of it. We get accused in Liverpool, we get accused across the board where you should be talking about poverty as poverty, but it is. Well, I think the concept of poverty, people struggle to define what that means. They know what it means, but I think from a campaigning perspective, the right to food gets in people's minds, it gets people thinking, it gets people saying, well, what is the right to food? Well, the right to food is income. From a trade union perspective, we've spoken to terms and conditions, you know, casualisation of labour, 0-hour contracts. These are all a massive contributing factor to where we are now, where people haven't got the ability to put a meal on the table. 60% of people are in work using universal credit. So for me, if we're looking at, it's a very good question, actually. If you're looking at how you break it down, if I wanted to take two elements of the Right to Food campaign, it would be universal free school meals, which I think a campaign on its own is just a brilliant campaign, and it's what we should all be considering really pushing. But it's within the elements of the Right to Food, and I think it was marked before. Right to food accountability. If you get it into legislation, the government today is accountable for its actions. If we would have had the right to food in legislation, they wouldn't have been able to cut universal credit by £20, but they would have had to come and answer what that would have on impact it have on the community. At the moment, they're now admitting that they're not doing any they haven't done any modelling on it.
But don't you think that that's, sorry.
Go on.
Don't you think that we are just talking about poverty, whereas it's not just about poverty, is it? It's also about people who do have money but can't get hold of the food that they want to or when they want. I've actually just seen someone's written up there, some places don't have shops, it's true. And before you turned
can
up,
I answer that?
Oh, wait, before you turned up, I was talking to the group about this double-decker bus I've converted into a greengrocer. So I'm wondering if there are any other campaigns such like that.
The fourth element of the right to food is ensure food security. We spoke today about this. Absolutely. Where we're in Liverpool, we've got food deserts where you've only got a corner shop which doesn't supply fruit and veg and things like that. So that's part of the planning. So if you have a look at the right to food submission and go through it, and then give me some honest opinion, you can email me, you can phone me up. Dee's got my number. And a key element of that is food security. And how we ensure, Dee touched on it about growing. We do something in Liverpool called Grow West Derby, and my constituency. Dee came out and seen it. You know, it's about encouraging people to be as self-sufficient as they can. But for me, why I'm so passionate about this and the right to food, it is because of poverty. It is because we've got 15 million people who can't put a meal on the table. Yeah. And until we address that, we're always going to have this, what we're seeing now, but on an industrial scale. And we have seen that since 2010, directly linked to austerity, directly linked to political decisions that are taken.
Just thank everybody for coming along, and particularly thanks Ian, because I know Ian's so busy. And I really do, and I think everybody does work. You know, we all do work. Dee, Kemi, Kelly, everybody's doing brilliant work. But for me, what we need to do is that if we adopt the banner of the Right to Food campaign, and also if we're involved in anything to do with football, fans supporting food banks, if we adopt those, you know, it should become an umbrella for all of that. We can sit under the group.